We're on DAF Kuf Mem Aleph Amid Aleph in the Mishnah. We're just starting the Mishnah now. It's the fourth line. And the Mishnah says, Hakash Sha'al Gabe Hamita Lo Yena'a Ne'enu Biyado, that if you have straw that is on top of a bed, you're not allowed to move it with your hand. Ela Mina'a Ne'o Begufo, but rather you can only move it with your body. Of course, the reason is that straw is considered to be muktzah, and you presumably have not designated it before Shabbos, since it's just lying out strewn willy-nilly across the bed. But therefore you're allowed to move it with your body, because that's what's known as tiltul min hatzad, that's non-direct movement, and then it's okay. Vim haya machal behema o shehaya lav kara o sadin mina'a ne'o biyado. However, if the hay or the straw is edible as fodder for animals, or if it was covered with a sheet or a pillow from before, so then that's a sign that it's non-muktzah, either because it's usable for food for animals, or because it was designated from before Shabbos to be used as a type of mattress for you on your bed, and therefore you want to puff it up, or you want to move it around, you can do that. Michbash shel balei batim. So Rashi explains that a michbash is a press, and the purpose of this press is to press your clothing. There would basically be two boards that would be connected by some kind of vertical pipe or some kind of apparatus, and you would slide down the top board on top of the lower board with the clothing in between, and you would lock it so that it would press the material very well. So if this is if in a private home, it doesn't have the industrial grade of the professional presses, and therefore matirin avolo kovshin, then you're allowed to undo it. If it's locked and it's Shabbos and you want to get the pants that are in the press, you're allowed to unlock it, because it's not so solidly locked like an industrial press. But you're not allowed to press things on Yontif, because on Shabbos, because it's an uvda dechol, it's a weekday activity, and it looks like you're doing a weekday activity. B'shel kovsin lo yigabo. But if it's an industrial grade, if it's an industrial press that is used by professionals, so then you're not allowed to touch it, because not only are you not allowed to press with it, but you're also not allowed to unlock it, because since it is such an industrial grade press, it is so well locked in with such pressure that by you unlocking it, it looks like you're undoing. It's like you're doing the opposite of tikkun. You're actually undoing an instrument on Shabbos, which would be prohibited. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im haya mutar me'erev Shabbos matir es kulo v'shamto. And Rabbi Yehuda says, I disagree, that in the event that it was unlocked from before Shabbos, then it's not totally muktzah. You're allowed to lift up the top board in order to be able to pull out the pants or whatever else that it is that you're pressing. Okay, so that's the machlokas. The Gemara will hopefully clarify this a little bit more. Amar of Nachman, hay pugla milamayla lamata shari milamata lamayla asir. Now we've seen this Gemara less than 3 weeks ago. We saw this Gemara, so it should be a little bit familiar in your minds. We talked about storing turnips in the ground. After you harvest turnips, it was commonly the practice since we didn't have refrigerators, so you would put the vegetable back in the ground to act as a refrigerator, to sort of preserve the produce. Now, on Shabbos, if I have a turnip that's been preserving in the ground and I want to pull it out, so Rav Nachman says that it all depends. If the turnip is right side up, you can pull it out, but if it's upside down, you may not pull it out. Why is that? The reason is because a turnip is in the shape of a top. It's wide on top, and it tapers and becomes very narrow at the bottom. So if it's upside down in the ground, then by pulling out the narrow end, I'm also pulling out earth, which is muktzah, together with it, and therefore, since I'm handling muktzah, albeit indirectly, Rav Nachman says that that's asur. If, however, the turnip is being stored in the earth right side up, so then by pulling it out of the ground, I'm not dislodging and moving earth, and therefore it's considered to be mutter. So Amar Rav Ada bar Abba, Amri Bey Rav, Tanina Deloka Rav Nachman. These rabbis say that our Mishnah proves that Rav Nachman is incorrect. Because it says in our Mishnah, Hakash al Gabi Hamita lo yena'a ne'o biyado, aval mena'a ne'o begufo. V'im haya meichel behemo shayel of karos adin mena'a ne'o biyado. So our Mishnah had said that even when the straw is muktzeh, because it wasn't prepared from the day before, you're still allowed to move it with your body. So you see that in indirect, like the Gemara says, Shema Mina, tiltul min atzad, lo shmei tiltul Shema Mina. You see that an indirect management or handling of muktzah is permitted. And this proves that Rav Nachman is mistaken, that as long as you indirectly handle the muktzah, then it's considered to be okay. So is everyone clear? The Gemara is making an analogy between moving something that's muktzah with another part of your body other than your hand, and also moving something that's muktzah indirectly by picking up something that's non-muktzah together with the muktzah that's connected to it. The Gemara says that both are called tiltul min hatzad, and if our Mishnah permits the tiltul min hatzad by moving something with your body, then it should also be permitted to pick up a turnip even though you're moving the earth with it. Okay, we go weiter. Amar Rav Yehuda, Hani Palpali, Meida Chada Chada Bekata Desakina Shari Tarti Aser. So he says as follows: when you want to mince pepper, he says, and you can do one at a time with the back of a knife, but you cannot do more than one at a time. In other words, just like we're talking about tiltul min hatzad, we're talking about doing different acts on Shabbos, which would normally be an Isser D'Rabbanan, but as long as you do it with a shinoi, as long as you change it in some fashion, it's going to be mutter. So what is the problem with mincing pepper? Mincing pepper is a form of tochen, it's a form of grinding or cutting into very tiny pieces. Normally that's usser, even though you normally do it with a mill, but even doing it by hand is usser. But if you do it by hand with a shinoi, using the back of a knife and doing one pepper at a time, it's okay. So Rava Amar Kevin de Mishani Afilu Tuvanami. And Rav is more liberal, and he says you can cut multiple peppers at a time as long as you do the shinoi of using the back of the knife, and then it's okay. Next, dak is very fine.
That's what I'm saying. That's even dak.
Even dak. It sounds yeah. Because otherwise, if it's not dak, then it's not. Then you can do it even lechatchila without a shinoi. Amar of Yehuda man desachi b'maya lingiv nafshe bereisha v'hadar lislik. Dilma asi li'isuye dalad amos bekarmelis. So Rav Yehuda says that if a person is swimming in water, he should dry himself off before moving completely out of the pool, because he may end up carrying 4 amos in a karmelis where this pool is situated, because the water is still on him and he's carrying water. So dry yourself off before you start walking outside of the pool. So the only thing that I had a difficulty with understanding, and I didn't have a chance to research this, is what about the Isser of swimming on Shabbos? Chazal made a general prohibition of swimming on Shabbos, lest you come to make a raft, lest you come to build a raft on Shabbos. So perhaps you'd have to argue that this is swimming b'makom mitzvah because he's doing some kind of immersion l'shem mitzvah. I'm not really sure, but the point is that this is in a karmelis, and therefore make sure you dry yourself off. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi ki kanachis nami kadachi kocho dalet amos va'asir." The Gemara says, but then even by that argument, even getting into a pool that's inside of a karmelis should be problematic, because as soon as you get in, you move water, you displace water through the movement of your body, and therefore just moving something dalet amos in a karmelis is also asr. Even if you're not carrying it or throwing it, but just causing it to move is asr.
Maybe if it's someone in distress, he dove in to help, but then once he's coming out, he has to observe Shabbos from it.
Could be. I don't know. The Gemara doesn't say that that's the case, that you're saving someone, but it could. I mean,
the article says technically okay, but poskim advised you shouldn't do it as long as the water's cold. The Isser was warm water, so if the water was cold, technically you could go. That's what it says.
I don't understand that. I think it needs a little bit more research, because the prohibition of swimming in a body of water is lest you come to build a raft. So it's got nothing to do with warm water or cold water.
Talking about bathing.
So bathing. Okay. All right. There's more to discuss about this. So the Gemara now says, Kocho bekarmelis lo gazrus. So answers the Gemara, the reason why it's not a problem to move the water when you get into the pool is because there's no gezerah of causing something to move inside a karmelis. That's only usher. The rabbis only forbade that in a Rishus HaRabim, but not in a karmelis, because it's a rabbinic prohibition to begin with, and a karmelis is only rabbinically prohibited domain, so therefore you don't have to worry about that. Amar Abaye v'tema Rav Yehuda. tit shal gabi raglo mekancho bekarka ve'in mekancho bekoso. So the halacha is like this: if you have mud that's caked on your foot, you can wipe it off on the ground, but you can't wipe it against the wall. So Amar Rava, my time of bekoso lo mishum demechsi kabona. What is your argument? The reason you can't wipe it on a wall is because it looks like you're spackling the wall with cement or mortar. Is that the reason why it's usher? He says, that's hard to swallow, he says, because habinyan chakla'u, that's a sort of, chakla'i is a farmer. He says that, that's like a bumpkin, unprofessional form of construction. No one builds walls that way by putting on mud with their foot onto a wall. So he says, I find that hard to believe that that's the problem. So Ela Omar Rava mekancho bekosel ve'ein mekancho bekarka dilma asi liyishvuye gumos. But rather Rava says just the opposite. It's permitted to wipe the mud against the wall, but you're not allowed to wipe it on the ground, lest you come to smooth out holes in the ground, which is an act of bona, and that's what's prohibited. Itmar mar berei de Ravina Omar echad zeh ve'echad zeh aser. Mar berei de Ravina says that both wiping it on a wall and wiping it on the floor is going to be aser. And Rav Papa Omar echad zeh ve'echad zeh mutar. And Rav Papa says just the opposite, they're both mutar. So the Gemara now asks, well, Mar berei de Ravina b'may mekanchilai. What are you supposed to wipe your foot with? If you got mud on your foot and you can't wipe it on a wall or the ground, how are you supposed to clean your foot on Shabbos? So the Gemara answers, mekanchilai bekora. If there's a piece of wood on the ground, a beam or some kind of log on the ground, then you can wipe it on that. Because then you don't have to worry about being mashva gumos, about filling holes into the earth, and you don't have to worry about looking like an act of construction in a wall. Amar Rava lo leisav in shapume dilechaya dilma migandira lechayfetz v'asi liisuye. We're going to see this later on in a Mishnah. We've seen it already before. It's going to be our segue to Maseches Eruvin, that a person should not sit right by the entrance of the mavoi. Now, a mavoi is, as we'll see later on, as long as you put a lechi on the entrance to the mavoi, which is a bar, and you make an eruv with the mavoi, so then you're allowed to carry in the mavoi. However, you should not walk all the way up to the entrance and sit down and start playing with an object in your hand. Because why? Because the object may slip out of your hand, you may drop it, and it'll roll out towards the Rishus Harabim, and since there's no clear demarcation between where the Mavoi begins and where the Rishus Harabim begins, you may end up carrying in a Rishus Harabim. Amar Rava lo litzaded inish kuba aara dilma asi la ashvuye gumos. Furthermore, a person shouldn't tilt a barrel on the ground when it's on the earth, and the reason is because you may end up, through the pressure of the movement of the barrel, end up smoothing out holes in the ground. Amar Rava lo lihodok inish udra bepuma deshisha. He says also a person should not take pieces of fabric, like it's called muchen, which is like stuffing, like pillow stuffing, which is made out of fabric or wool, and use that as a bottle stopper in a little bottle that has liquid in it. And the reason is dilma asili de schita, because you may end up, because the stuffing will get wet, and you'll end up, by pressing it in with pressure into the bottle, you're going to end up doing schita on Shabbos, squeezing on Shabbos. Amar Rav Kahana, tit shal gabe bigdo mekaskaso mebifnim ve'in mekaskaso mibachutz. If a person has mud on his garment, so he's allowed to rub the garment in order to get the mud, the caked mud off. He's allowed to do that on the inner part of his garment, but not on the exterior, because it looks too much like he's doing an act of laundering. So Meisvei, the Gemara now challenges that. It says, Tit shal gabi min olo megaruro begav sakin. The Brisa says that if there's mud caked on your shoe, you're allowed to scrape it off with the back of a knife, but v'shal bigdo megaro bitziporin uvilvad shelo yekaskes. But if there's mud caked on your garment, you're only allowed to scrape it off with a fingernail, but you're not allowed to rub the garment, back and forth, rubbing it, right? You're not allowed to do that. So my lav shelo yekaskes klal, doesn't the Brisa seem to contradict what we just said before? That the Brisa, our previous statement was that you're allowed to rub it as long as it's on the inside of the garment, and here it says you're not allowed to rub it at all. So the Gemara says, Lo, shelo yekaskes mibachutz ela mibifnim. No, the Brisa is not contradicting what we said. It just means that you can't rub the outside of the garment, but you're allowed to rub the inside of the garment. So Amar Rabbi Avahu, Amar Rabbi Lazar, Amar Rabbi Yanai, Megarin minal chadash avalo yashan. So he says, Rabbi Yanai, that you're allowed to scrape with some kind of instrument the exterior of a shoe in order to either clean it, I guess, or to make it smooth, you can only do that with a new shoe, but you cannot do it with an old shoe. And the reason why is because an old shoe, once the leather is aged, it becomes somewhat frayed on the surface, and by using some kind of instrument to scrape it, you're showing that you're trying to process or perfect the leather in some kind of way, and that's a tolda of mimachek, which is smoothing something that's rough. So the Gemara now says, "Bamemegararosa," with the new shoe, that there's no problem of a memachek. What instrument should you use to smooth it or to scrape it, its exterior? So Amar Rabbi Avohu begav sakin. Once again, don't use a normal instrument. Use the back of a knife. Amar lehahu saba sami didach mikamai mikmi hadetani Rabbi Chia. He says that I want you to erase what you just taught, where you are permissive to scrape a shoe as long as it's a new shoe. He says the Bryce of Rabbi Chia contradicts what you just said, because it says ein megarin lo min al chadash v'lo min al yashan, that the Bryce says that you're not allowed to scrape at all a shoe, regardless of whether it's new or old. So therefore, you're too liberal. And furthermore, the Bryce says v'lo yasuch es rag lo shemen v'hu b'socha min al. You're not allowed to pour oil on your foot if your foot is inside of a shoe, because we have to realize that oil was used to make leather soft and supple. And so by pouring it on your foot, even if your intention is to pour the oil on your foot, but if your foot is inside a shoe or a sandal, or besocha sandal, then it looks too much like you're processing the leather. But what you are allowed to do is you're allowed to pour oil on your foot when it's not inside a shoe, and then when the oil is already on your foot, you can insert your foot inside a shoe or a sandal. As long as, and again, like Rashi qualifies, as long as your intention is not to use the oil, your primary intention is to anoint your foot. If, as a byproduct, you put your foot in the shoe and the shoe gets a little oil on it, since that's not your primary kavanah, we paskin like Rav Shimon, a davar she'eino miskavin is mutter, so therefore it's mutter. V'sach kol gufo shemenu misagel al gabi katablaya ve'eino choshesh. Furthermore, a person can put oil all over his body on Shabbos, which is perfectly fine, and even afterwards, if you want to lie down on a newly boiled piece of leather, which is used as a mat, and once again, they would pour oil on this typically in order to make it more supple and soft, even though you're going to be rolling around on this mat and the oil will invariably get off onto the mat. It's mutter because it's a davar she'eino miskavin. What about the fact that it's a psik reisha? The Gemara doesn't discuss that over here. It's an interesting omission. Amar Rav Chisda lo shanu elo letzachzecho avol la'abdo asur. So Rav Chisda says that it's only permitted as long as when you put on the oil and you lie down on the mat, you only do it in order to polish the leather, but not in order to process the leather by making it softer. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara says, "V'la'abdo asur avol asur." So the Gemara says, "La'abdo." If your intention is to process the hide by rolling around with your freshly oiled body, pshita, that's obvious that that's asur v'su. And furthermore, to polish leather, since when would that ever be permitted? If your intention is by lying down, if your primary intention is to polish the leather, how would that ever be permitted? That's never going to be permitted. So ela I itmar hachi itmar. But if anything was said, it was stated by Rav Chisda as follows: Amar Rav Chisda lo shanu ela shiur letzachzecho avol shiur la'abdo asur. That of course your primary objective cannot be to have anything to do with the leather. Your primary intention was that you wanted to put oil on your body to feel good, and then you're allowed to lie down and even roll around on this newly boiled mat. And as long as there's not so much oil on your body that this amount of oil would be used to process the leather. As long as there's only a surface amount of oil on your body that's only enough to polish, plus the fact that it's not your objective to polish it, then it's mutter to roll around on this leather mat. So you need two qualifications. It has to be a davar she'eino miskavein, plus there can't be so much oil on your body such that you would be processing the hide. And I guess that takes care of the psik reisha issue, because since it's only an isur derabanan to be mitzachzeach, to polish leather on Shabbos, therefore, since it's not your kavanah to do it, it's okay. Tana Rabbana. Lo yetze katan b'man al gadol, aval yotzehu b'chiluk gadol. A small person, here the word katan doesn't necessarily mean just a child. It can mean just a person who's of small stature. He's got a small shoe size, right? So you shouldn't walk out with a big shoe, right, on Shabbos. Why? Because it could fall off and you'll end up carrying it. But what you are allowed to do is you're allowed to walk around with a larger than size garment. Let's say, you're only a size 38 and you put on a guy who's a size 46. That's okay. Why? Because you're not going to take it off. Because you don't have any clothes underneath. And therefore, it's okay. We're not worried you're going to take it off. Below seitze isha bimin al mirufat. A woman should not walk outside on Shabbos with a torn shoe because we're worried that she'll be embarrassed and take it off. Below sachalosbo, and furthermore, she should not do chalitza with it because it's not really a fully legitimate shoe because it's torn. However, b'di'evet v'ncholza chalitza sekshera, but b'di'evet, if she does chalitza with it, it's a kosher chalitza. The ein yotzen b'minal chadash. Furthermore, you shouldn't walk outside with a new shoe because if a new shoe, you're wearing it for the first time, it may be uncomfortable and you're going to come to take it off. Now, be'eza minal amru b'minal shalisha, but that's only true by women's shoes. Men don't have are not as fastidious about their shoes. So therefore, a man can walk out with a new shoe, but a woman should not walk out with a new shoe. She may feel uncomfortable, it may be awkward, she may come to take it off and carry it. So Tony bar kapara lo shano ela shelo yatzabo shah echas miba'od yom, aval yatzabo me'erev Shabbos mutar. So he qualifies it and says that's only true if she hasn't tried it on to wear it a little bit from before Shabbos. Then we have to worry that if she's wearing it for the first time, she's not going to be happy, she's going to take it off. But if she tried it on already and walked around just a little bit from before Shabbos, she knows what it feels like, and therefore she can wear it on Shabbos. Tani chader shomtin minal me'al gabi imos, v'tanya idach ein shomtin. So we have two brises. One brise says that you're allowed to remove a newly manufactured shoe from off of its mold. So let's understand, what is a mold? When you're a cobbler and you're making shoes, you have this piece of wood that you place your pieces of leather on, and you stitch the leather, and then you fashion it over the mold so that it'll have the shape of a shoe, so that the foot will be able to fit inside of it. Now, it's important to know that the mold itself is muktzah, because it's a klishim lachto le'isser. It's something that's used for isser. And the shoe itself is the question: are you allowed to? Is the shoe itself muktzah now? Is it a shoe, and therefore it's non-muktzah? Or is it not yet considered a shoe because it hasn't been removed from the mold yet, and therefore it's considered to be muktzah? So we have one brisa that says that you are allowed to remove the shoe from the mold, and another brisa that says that you're not allowed to remove the shoe from the mold. So the Gemara says, Lo kasha, ha-Rabbi Eliezer ha-Rabban, and it's a machlokes tanoim, that not, as the Mishnah says, Minal shal gabi imus Rabbi Eliezer mitahir v'chachamim mitamim. We have a Mishnah that talks about this, that if you have a shoe that it's on the mold, so then Rabbi Eliezer says that the shoe is not makabel tumah, because it's not a kli yet, and by virtue of that it's not a kli, it's also going to be muktzah. But the chachamim say no, it's a full-blown shoe, it's already finished, right? All it needs is to be removed from the mold, and therefore it's considered to be non-muktzah because it's makabel tumah, it's a kli. So the Gemara now says, Hanicha l'Rava damar davar shemalachtu le'isser ben l'tzarach chufa ben l'tzarach makamu mutar shapir. Now, let's talk about this regarding the mold now. Rava holds that if I have muktzah, then I need either the place of the muktzah, or I need to move the muktzah itself, because I need the muktzah for some other purpose, so I'm allowed to move a kli that is muktzah on Shabbos. Now, it works out well according to Rava, because even though I'm going to be moving the mold in order to remove the shoe off of it, it's permitted for me to move the mold because I need the shoe. So that's what's called l'tzarach makomo. I need the place of the mold in order to be able to get at the shoe, and therefore I'm justified in moving the mold together with the new shoe. But according to Abaya, who says that you're only allowed to move a muktzah kli if you need the kli itself, but if you just need the place of the kli, then you're not allowed to move the muktzah kli. What are you going to say? According to Abaya, what right do you have to move the mold if you're only moving it in order to get at the shoe that's on top of it? According to Abaya, it should be usher to remove the shoe because invariably you're going to be moving the mold. That's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara answers, Hacha b'mayaskinon b'rafui. What we're talking about over here, you have to say, according to Abaya, the shoe is loosely fitting on the mold, and therefore you can remove the shoe without moving the mold. And that's what we're talking about, where you'll just be able to lift off the shoe without moving the mold. So So the Gemara now says, D'Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Im Haya Rafoi Mutar. And we even have a brisa to support this, that Rabbi Yehuda says that the only time it's permitted is if the shoe is fitting loosely on the mold. So it's mashal just like we said, that you don't have to move the mold in order to get to the shoe. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, now that we have this brisa, let's reverse the question and ask on Rava. Taima de Rafui, hello Rafui lo. Hanichali Abaya domer dover shemalach delis l'sarch gufa mut l'sarch mekamo aser shapir lo Rava domer ben l'sarch gufa ben l'sarch mekamo mutar ma yiri Rafui afilu lo Rafui nami. So the Gemara's question is, that only this statement of Rabbi Yehuda in the Brisa only works according to Abaya, who says that the only reason you're allowed to move it is because you're not moving the mold, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda had to qualify it by saying that it's a loose-fitting shoe. The shoe is loosely fitting onto the mold. But according to Rava, why is it necessary to say that the shoe is fitting loosely on the mold? Even if it's tightly fitting onto the mold, you should be allowed to move the mold, according to Rava, because it's l'tzarech mekamo is mutter. So how does Rava make sense of this Brisa of Rabbi Yehuda? So the Gemara's answer is, Hahi de Rabbi Yehuda mishum de Rabbi Eliezer hu. The Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer mishum Rabbi Eliezer m'hayirafui mutar. No, you're misunderstanding. Rabbi Yehuda is not going according to the Chachamim, he's going according to Rabbi Eliezer. Meaning like this, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the shoe is muktzah because it's not a kli. Why? So Rabbi Yehuda says because it's tightly fitting onto the mold, which indicates that it's not yet ready to be used. Because if it were ready to be used, it would be easily removable from the mold. And so comes along Rabbi Yehuda and says that even according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that the shoe is muktzah because it's not a kli yet, that's only true if it's tightly fitting onto the mold. But if it's loosely fitting on the mold, then that's an indication that the shoe is completed and ready for use, and therefore Rabbi Eliezer would agree that it's non-muktzah. Abaya takes that opinion of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Eliezer's shita and applies it to the Chachamim as well. And he says that even according to the Chachamim, you're only allowed to move the shoe when it's loosely fitting. Because, why? Because otherwise you wouldn't be allowed to move the mold. It's true that according to the Chachamim, the shoe is a kli whether it's tightly fitting or not, but as far as moving the shoe, you're only allowed to move it if it's loosely fitting.
According to the first opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, is it a makav pater by taking it out? Because that's really what's completing it?
That's an interesting point. I don't think so, because you're not actually changing the shoe. You're just removing it from the mold. I think that would be the distinction. If I was pressed for it, that would be my cursory answer. But the point of the Gemara saying over here is that Rava and Abaya have this machlokas in the Chachamim Shita as to whether you're allowed to move the mold or not, and therefore, according to Abaya, it's only mutter if the shoe is loose-fitting, so you don't have to move the mold. And according to Rava, you can move the shoe even if you have to move the mold to get it off because they're tightly attached. Hadron alach tol. Let's go weiter. We'll just do a few more lines. We start the Mishnah. No tel adam esbeno v'ha'evin biyado, that a person is allowed to carry his child even if the child has a muktzah rock in his hand. Now, it's very important to observe that we're not talking about carrying in a Rishus Harabim here. We're talking simply about the laws of muktzah. I'm in the privacy of my home or my chutzner. There's no problem of carrying. The problem here is, am I allowed to lift up my child when he's holding a muktzah object? So the Mishnah says, yes, you are allowed to pick him up because you're not handling the muktzah. So the kalkola v'ha'even b'socha, and you're also allowed to pick up a basket which has a muktzah rock inside of it because you're not handling the muktzah, you're handling the basket. The Gemara will clarify this. And furthermore, if you have a big container, and one portion of that container has truma that's tameh, which is muktzah, but another portion of the container has truma that's tahor, then you're allowed to lift up the whole container. And the same thing is if it's part of the basket or the container has truma and I'm a non-kohen, so that's muktzah for me, and another part of it has chulin, then I'm allowed to pick up the whole thing because of the chulin that's contained within. Rabbi Yehuda Omer af malinis hameduma be'echad umeya. And Rabbi Yehuda has another heter that he says, here's another thing that you're allowed to do. Now there's a halacha called dimu'ah. Now what is dimu'ah? It's basically when truma falls into chulin, we say we don't aser all of the chulin as long as there's a 100-to-1 ratio of chulin over the truma. If that's the case, then we say that the truma is batal. But with one added caveat, and that is, you need to remove, after this has all gotten mixed in between truma and chulin, you need to remove 1/100th of this mixture and discard it or give it, treat it as truma, and then the rest of it, the other 99 parts, or the extra 100 parts, I should say, because it's 101 parts now, you remove 1/101 of this mixture, and the 100 out of the 101 parts are now mutter. It's a rabbinic requirement. Rabbi Yehuda says normally you're not allowed to tithe or rectify something on Shabbos, but this kind of rectification is mutter, and the Gemara will tell us why later on. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Amar Rava, Hotzi Tinok Chai, V'kis Toloi B'tzavaro Chayev Mishum Kis. Excuse me. Rava now says a completely independent halacha, and let's not get confused between the laws of muktzah and the laws of hotza'ah. Our Mishnah was talking about the muktzah issue. Rav is talking about the hotza'ah issue. Rav is saying that if a person carries a child in Rishus Harabim, and the child has a pouch around his neck, so then I'm chayav for carrying the pouch. I'm not chayav for carrying the child. Tinok meis v'kis talilo b'tzavaro pater. But if Nebuch, a person carries a dead child, and the child has a pouch around its neck, so then the person who carried the deceased child is pater for both the child and for the pouch. Now we have to clarify. Tinok chayv v'kis talilo b'tzavaro chayv mishum kis. Why are you only chayav for carrying, when you're carrying a live child with a pouch around its neck, you're only chayav for carrying the pouch? V'li chayav nami mishum tinok. Why aren't you chayav for carrying the child? Rava Rabbi Nassan Sviralei Damarchai Nosei Yasatzmo. The answer is because Rava holds like Rabbi Nassan, who says that any living creature, you're not liable if you carry it, because a living being is sort of carries itself, suspends itself, and therefore it's not called carrying. But you are chayav for carrying the pouch that's attached to the child. That you are chayav for. Frek the Gemara v'liftel kis l'gabei tinok milot znanes achai b'mita pater avalamita shamita tfeilalo. The Gemara says, but why don't we say that the pouch is ancillary to the child? And just like I'm pater for carrying the child, I should be pater for anything that's ancillary to the child, because like we have a Mishnah that says that if I transport a living person on a stretcher on Shabbos outside, I'm going to be pater not only for carrying the living person, but also for carrying the stretcher, because the stretcher is tafel, it's batel, it's ancillary to the living person. So I'm really just carrying a living person and his accoutrements, and therefore I'm pater. So the Gemara says, why don't you say the same thing over here? The Gemara says, Mita lagabe chai mevatli le, kis lagabe tinok lo mevatli le. The answer is that a stretcher is ancillary to its occupant, but a pouch is not ancillary to a child. That's the reason why, because the pouch is not servicing, so to speak, the child, and therefore it's considered to be its own separate entity, and I'm liable for carrying it. So now the Gemara says, okay, what about the second statement of Rava? Tinok meis v'kis talulo b'tzavaro pater, that if you carry a deceased child in a pouch around its neck, you're going to be pater for both. The Gemara says, v'li chayiv mishum tinok, why aren't you liable for carrying the deceased child? You're carrying him on Shabbos. So Rabbi Shimon Svirlei Damar Kol Malacha Shein Tzricha Lagufa Pater Alea. Answers the Gemara, you're pater for carrying the deceased child because it's a malacha shein tzricha lagufa, and according to Reb Shimon, it's an isser derabanan, but certainly you haven't done a malacha deoraisa. What do we mean by malacha shein tzricha lagufa? You're not carrying the deceased child for the sake that you need the deceased child. You're carrying the deceased child to dispose of the deceased child by burial, and therefore, since you're not carrying it because you have a need for the object that you're carrying, that's not called the malacha in its original format, and therefore you're going to be pater for it. The Gemara doesn't address why you're not liable for carrying the pouch, though, that's around the deceased child's neck. Rashi says that in that scenario, the pouch is ancillary to the deceased child, because the only reason why the pouch is around the child's neck, and I don't know how the Rashi and Tosfos know this, is because you put it there in order to distract you from the tragedy of the situation. The pouch is around the deceased child's neck as a diversion or a way of sort of alleviating the stress of the tragedy of having to take care of a deceased child. And therefore, there the pouch is ancillary because its whole purpose is for the sake of the functionary purposes of carrying the child outside in the first place. Next, Tanan. Now let's compare this teaching of Rava to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had said, no til adam espinova even biyada, that a person is allowed to pick up a child with the muktzah object in his hand. So the Gemara's question is like this: if the stone or the rock is considered to be ancillary to the child, then why don't we say that the pouch is ancillary to the child when carrying also? If there's no problem of muktzah in our Mishnah, so why is there a problem of carrying when we talked about when Rabbi talks about carrying? So Amri Devei Rabbi Yana B'tinok sheyesh lo gi aguin alaviv. Our Mishnah is talking about a case where the child is extremely distressed. He's crying, he's carrying on, he's having a tantrum because he wants daddy to pick him up. So in that scenario, only then do the Chachamim say, it's true that even though by picking up your child you're also picking up the rock, but we're going to suspend that prohibition of muktzah for the sake of the distressed child. But that's only in that scenario that we sort of say that there's no problem of muktzah. But in Ochinami, if you're doing a malacha deoraisa where the rock is not ancillary to the child, then you are doing a malacha, and therefore you're going to be chayiv. So frek the Gemara, ihachi my irya even afilu dinar nami. Alama amar Rava lo shanu ela even abal dinar asur. So the question is, if the Chachamim suspended the prohibition of muktzah because the child is under distress, so then why did Rava say that it's only permitted when the child is holding a rock, but if the child is holding a coin, then we will not give you the heter, even if the child is under distress? So the Gemara answers, Even inafla lo asi avia li isuye, dinar inafla asi aviv avuha li isuye. The Gemara answers very simply. He says the concern is by a coin, if the child drops the coin, the father may be tempted to pick it up, and therefore we don't allow you to pick up the child who's holding a coin. But with a rock, the father says, halavai, he should drop the rock. I don't want him to be holding on to this rock. So therefore, there's no concern that you may pick it up directly if we let you pick up the child holding the rock. And we'll hold it here for today. Have a wonderful day.